There are a couple of things I want to talk about before we begin this episode today. One is friendships, especially male friendships. When it comes to women, you sense that a friendship between two women can be deep and intimate. Female friends find it easy to share everything with each other and are not scared of making themselves vulnerable. In a sense, the best thing about the friendship is that you can be vulnerable, that the constant effort of maintaining a filter doesn't weigh you down. Men, however, keep it more on the surface. We are supposed to be strong. We are supposed to be stoic. We will not wear our emotions on our sleeve, and especially not our emotions for each other, God forbid. We will find it hard to be vulnerable, and our friends may go through a lifetime of knowing us without knowing what makes us cry at night, what makes us feel weak and helpless. My point is not that a friendship is only about sharing vulnerability. There is in fact no evidence that the friendship at the heart of today's episode did too much of that. But it's about getting past the filters we maintain for the outside world at large, and this can sometimes be a problem with male friendships. My second theme of this brief intro is about personal writing. Too often when we write, we are wary of using the word I. Now, in some genres, that's not an appropriate word. If you are writing history or economic analysis or doing reportage from the field, the I should mostly be avoided. But when you allow yourself to do personal writing, whether in a personal essay or when you interweave yourself into some other narrative that benefits from it, I think the result can be beautiful. My favorite moments in the 371 episodes of this podcast so far are when people are talking about themselves. It's always a personal, because a personal is always universal. I love that kind of conversation, and I love that kind of book.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Ramachandra Guha, making his 6th appearance on the show. Ram's latest book is called The Cooking of Books, which is structured as a memoir of his friendship with the publisher and editor Rukun Advani, who was known to be famously reclusive and who must have viewed with much bemusement and perhaps alarm the strange occurrence of an enthusiastic friend writing a whole memoir about him. I loved Ram's book not just for the touching account of this friendship, but also because it is a portrait of a time that is now behind us. And the act of looking back can also help us make sense of these present times. Ram had just a couple of hours to give me for this recording, and as listeners would know, he is the only person I make this exception for. Everyone else, sit your ass down for 10 hours. Anyway, before you begin listening, let's take a quick commercial break. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Ram, welcome again to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks, Amit.
I had, so much fun reading this book, and over time what has happened, as you might have noticed, is that we've done 5 episodes so far, and I really like the trajectory of those episodes, because initially we began by talking about your books and being kind of formal and all of that, but it got more and more personal, and the personal glimpses that I have got really charm me, and that's sort of what I look for. And this book was completely personal in that sense, and I had a broader question to start with, which is that typically, I would imagine what happens when you're writing history is that you're editing out a lot of the truth. Every book of history chooses one narrative, one set of things to focus on, and nothing can capture the complexity of the world, which is the way it is. That is what it is. We do the best we can. And in the act of sort of writing it down, we almost solidify the narrative that we have, and that becomes part of the discourse on whatever we are writing about. And I wonder if that also happens in the personal realm, in the sense that what you've done in the cooking of books is you've written about a personal friendship. And until one sits and thinks about it, a friendship is this vast, amorphous thing where you have a bunch of memories, some are good, some are bad, but you never actually sit down and try to define it for what it is, and etc. etc. There's nothing particularly in focus. And I wonder if the act of writing forces you to give a narrative to it, to sort of define it in a particular way, as it were, and also maybe helps you understand it better, or look at some things in a new light. Tell me a little bit about that.
I will, but before I do that, I just like to take issue with one of your phrases which you began with, that when is writing a work of history, one is not editing out the truth. One is being selecting from multiple facts to see which are more salient.
That's
more
actually what I meant. I didn't mean it in that pejorative way. That manufacturing.
And then shape the narrative in a particular way. Both that it's compelling, convincing, and manageable in terms of length. Though my books have turned out to be rather long. I mean, this one, The Cooking of Books, is at once my most personal and more or less my shortest book, right? But even there is a lot of shaping, reshaping, editing, chopping, changing, sometimes in the interest of readability, literary artifice, sometimes in the interest of not wanting to give offense. This book will give offense to many people, but you would have seen that some names have been redacted, some have not. And there are different reasons for why that is so. Those with the public domain, their names have not been redacted. There were sections that I found in the earlier drafts that were too self-indulgent. Though this is a particularly short book by my standards, it's gone through more drafts than any other book I've written. I mean, there are 14 people thanked in the acknowledgements, and I took their comments sequentially, not all at once, and I revised each time based on the comments I got from one of those 14 readers. But I'm happy with how it's turned out. I mean, I think I also got... There was stuff in the penultimate draft that was self-indulgent. I mean, there's a long section on an article I'd written on St. Stephen's College, which Rukun had rewritten for me. And I felt that there was enough on St. Stephen's College already, and it would be too much for some readers. But yes, I mean, even a memoir, you see, this is a memoir, not an autobiography. Now, it so happens that I've thought a lot about what an autobiography represents. Not so much about a memoir, because I've written two biographies of it. The first was a Warrior Elvin, and the second was a Mahatma Gandhi. And both my subjects left autobiographies. Well, Gandhi's is, of course, one of the most celebrated works of Indian literature ever written, the story of my experiments with truth. But Elvin's is not an insignificant work either. The Tribal World of Warrior Elvin won the Sahitya Academy Award, which is very rarely given to a work of non-fiction. It's usually given to novels. It's a beautiful, compelling read, describes the arc of his life and, the controversies and sort of shifts in a career that he undertook and so on. And when I was working on Elvin, people asked me, what is there that I'll not find in his autobiography? And I stumbled upon the line that an autobiography is a preemptive strike against a future biographer, right? Which I quote in my book, and likewise with Gandhi. So, and a memoir to the same extent. What it leaves out may be as interesting or as significant as what it includes. Less so than an autobiography, because this is not an autobiography. This is a memoir of a friendship, a personal and professional friendship. But it did go through many more drafts than more or less anything I've written. I usually write quickly, clearly, accessibly. Even India After Gandhi went through 2 drafts at most, even though it's 1,000 pages. This one has been really reshaped and rewritten very many times based on the comments of people I respect and based on my own rethinking about what should go in and what should be left out.
I'll take issue with your phrase self-indulgent, because we say it almost as if it is a bad thing, and once upon a time I would have thought like that. But I also think, and particularly when it comes to a memoir, that, I would think of self-indulgent as being the same as indulging the reader. The reader wants to know more about you, and there's no harm in kind of sinking into that. By the way, I must say that the book read so well that I was surprised. I'm surprised when you tell me it had so many drafts, because it just reads like, you just sat and you wrote it and everything just flows so kind of beautifully. And I'll dive in a little bit into that self-indulgence point, because I remember even in the book, you've got all these places where Rukun Advani, and of course we'll talk about the friendship and about him soon, but you've got all these places where he's giving you comments on your books. And one of the things that stands out is that there are times where he is, like that third book about cricket that you said you were doing, where you're expanding to the globe, right? And I think the crux of his criticism there was that it is too personal and you've got to have that broader social significance and etc built into it. He had his own thesis about Pakistan and so on, which you've quoted at length. And I thought that, oh my God, no, why didn't you write that? That was fine. It's fine to be personal, because, I just, especially in the way that this podcast has evolved, I find so much value and beauty in that.
No, but he was right about that particular cricket book. It's you see, I also don't use self-indulgent necessarily in a pejorative way. It's a writer who is now 65, who has practiced his profession for more than 4 decades, who's reasonably in the public eye, wants to say something about his story, but not about his achievements or about his marriage or his family life, but about one particular friendship that meant so much to him professionally and personally, particularly professionally. And so it's revelatory. And you're right, some readers would want that, others would be pissed off. I mean, I think I say in the preface that this book will be read in various ways, as a partisan account of publishing, as a self-indulgent celebration of elite male privilege. And that, I think that criticism will come, and there may be an element of truth in that, because these are two men, relatively privileged, educated in the best colleges and the best universities, talking about themselves, right? So, but insofar as it is, the exercise is novel, rare and possibly unique. A writer writing at such length about his editor. If I may just, and I feel vindicated in doing this by recent experiences in literary festivals. So I've been in 2 literary festivals recently, in both of which there was a writer more celebrated than me, more famous than me, in conversation with his editor. And the editor was talking up the writer, about what a privilege it was to publish him, what the great books he'd written, how much they'd sold, what kind of fan mails were coming to the writer. And the editor was a sort of deferential, you can say, not Sutradhar, but almost a supplicant. And this happened at 2 literary festivals. And the next day, I was talking up my absent editor, who was eradicated and would show his face. So, usually it is editors talking up writers, Sometimes the recollections are tinged with bitterness, like Diana Ethel when she writes about V.S. Naipaul in her book Strength. But it's clear who is writing about whom. So in that sense, since this was a book about a remarkable editor whose imprint is never visible in the books he's edited, often his name is not even in the acknowledgements, Of course, will never appear on stage, has never appeared on stage, and who's played such a special role, an editor who's played such a special role, not merely in my life, in nurturing dozens of high-quality works by other historians, sociologists, economists, and I've named some of the people he's worked with in my book. And in that sense, he has been a credit to Indian publishing, who is not as well known as inferior editors, who are kind of write columns, write about themselves, write about authors, go to literary festivals, and certainly not as well known as absolutely obscure compared to the writers whom he's made visible and successful and popular. So I'm gratified by the reception so far, that I think I've done some, it's been, and Amit, kind of paying tribute comes naturally to me. Of course, you would know I do it to cricketers of the past, and not just Karnataka cricketers, I should say for the record, but cricketers of other states and other countries too. But I often find that when someone dies, I'm the person writing a tribute. When Girish Karnad dies, even though I'm not an expert on Kannada literature, knowing him as, had an impact on me, and I want to write about him. Mahashweta Devi dies, and I don't read Bangla, but I had 2 or 3 meetings with her, which left such a visible imprint on me that I had to write about her. So, in a sense, celebration of extraordinary, remarkable people, often dead but sometimes living, has been part of what I've been doing for a very long time in my writing, both in my newspaper writing, in my books, in my essays. And I thought that this person who has been played such a fundamental role in my life, as I say, next only to my wife Sujata, and yet be so unknown, and this is the time to write about him.
I found it very moving and very different from, all the other sort of profiles you've written of people or the memories you've shared of them, because this is, a personal friendship. It's not a hero of yours that you're writing about or someone you knew at a distance. I found it very moving. I was also wondering about the nature of memory, because one thing I have realized when I sit with my friends and talk, or people I've known for a long time, is that we remember the same things very differently, right? It's like, like what the hell is going on? We are just both characters in each other's interior lives, and they don't really match up. And even in this book, you've got a bunch of places where Rukun's memory of something which you've just related is at odds with yours. And I kind of wonder about that. And then does having access to the way that they looked at you also change the way you look at yourself in some way? Like, for example, there's a delightful letter you've quoted when, you were going to go to Afghanistan for something, and Rukun wrote to Sujata and said, stop him, he must not go. And Sujata replied to him, quote, I need hardly tell you that your friend has never listened to anybody in his life and certainly seems unlikely to start doing so now. While I agree with everything in your mail, I think you overestimate the children's and my influence on him. He's decided he wants to go, and that's it. And I wonder how you feel reading this, because at the time you would not perhaps have thought that you were so stubborn or,
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the letter that Rukun wrote to Sujata has been lost because she migrated to another email address and he couldn't save it. And that would have been, in his characteristic, forceful, blunt, direct style. But yes, absolutely. I mean, that I just thought I'm going to Kabul and that's it. I mean, what's the risk? I mean, as it happened, a week after I went, the ambassador's house was attacked because the foreign secretary was staying there, but I had left by that time, right? So, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, but going through these letters gave me a sense that there may be a book in it. So, because it was not composed simply of memories. There was a kind of a documentary depth to my recounting of this friendship based on letters which began in 1986. So, almost 40 years. And there were memories of meetings and memories of conversations. But I think had I not had this personal archive of our correspondence, I couldn't have written this book.
I also want to ask about this correspondence, because it seems to me that there are two aspects that this, in which these long letters we used to write to each other plays out. And one of them you've mentioned in your book. The first one is that writing a long letter back in the day, where you're taking the trouble to actually get paper or an inland letter or whatever, and you're sitting down at a desk and there is a physical act of writing, is really different. Like, at one level, you are sort of communicating by the very act of writing that you matter to me. That is why I am making all of this effort in writing to you. And at another level, because of that, those letters tend to be much longer. There is thought that goes into it. There is some thereof. You're not necessarily typing them somewhere with a backspace available to you. So you're thinking about what you're going to write. Perhaps you have been thinking about it for a couple of days before you send it. There's that marination of ideas happens and changes you as a result. And in modern times, a lot of the communication happens through almost transactional emails. They're like cold and okay, I'll be there at 7. That's a typical kind of email length that you'll find. Whereas it used to be different. And I'm wondering, so part one of my question is that, part two, of course, is that how this makes life harder for the historian, that we no longer have all of those letters available. You've spoken about that in your book. I'm equally interested in, what effect it has on the person. Like, I'm guessing from whatever excerpts that you've shared that you continued writing long letters to each other even though the format changed. But that is because you were letter writers of that type, and that is how you would communicate. So what are your thoughts?
Well, we still do. So this morning, well, I can share this because it's part of the book. Now, the book ends with a great Kumaoni historian called Shekhar Pathak, who was an old dear friend of mine, and whom Rukun has befriended recently because Rukun lives in Ranikhet and Shekhar Pathak is in Nainital, and Rukun has recently published his book. And Shekhar wrote me a beautiful, both of us, a beautiful letter about this book. with some images from the mountains, saying, your exchanges are like the mountains and their moods, sunny in summer and temperamental in the monsoon. It's a lovely letter, right? And Rukun wrote back a long letter saying that, what Shekhar's friendship has meant to him. And now, similarly, he and I continue corresponding, Rukun and I, about all kinds of things. And sometimes in a day, there'll be 4 letters on each side of 5 or 6 paragraphs each. So there was an exchange about a writer we greatly admire, whom I will not name, except to say he's an Indian writer whom we both greatly admire. And we admire different aspects of his work. So this exchange was going on now. And because not only have we corresponded this way for so long, more importantly, that's the only way Rukun likes to keep the friendship going. If I go to see him in Ranikhet, which I did once, he will have lunch with me. If I WhatsApp him, he won't usually return my message. If I call him, the line will go cold, right? This is what he likes. And one day, I will present the full archive of our correspondence, to some place, because there's so many, as I said, an exchange about the mountains, an exchange about an Indian writer, an exchange about, music, which he's passionate about, and he listens. Of course, he's deeply knowledgeable about Western classical music, but my interests are more Hindustani, and that's my other friendships, which are sometimes be as intimate and as close, not professionally as formative in my career, but say a friendship, shall we say, one of my closest friends was the remarkable civil servant and music scholar Keshav Desiraju, right? And I think of him almost every day. He died 2 years ago, shortly after completing his fine book on M.S. Subbulakshmi, and after spending a career in really reshaping health delivery in modern India, right? Now, and we were very close friends, intimate friends. So unlike Rukun and I, we would talk 2 or 3 times a day. But I often think of him, but could I write a book on our friendship? Because it would be diffuse, unstructured, inchoate, all over the place. It would have some nice touches, but it wouldn't have this, you could say, depth, that these letters provide. And Rukun writes to a few other people in the same way, at similar length. And I think that's what he likes.
Earlier you spoke about how you've written at one point in your book about, 2 of the ways in which it can be seen: a partisan account of publishing in India and a self-indulgent celebration of elite male privilege. And none of those are actually true, but the other possibilities you lay out in the paragraph about it in your book are as a memoir of friendship and as an elegy to a lost world. And to me, it works beautifully on both those regards. And I want to double click on friendship in general. Like there is this concept of Dunbar's number that we can't actually, remember the names of more than 150 people. That's a total number of people our brains are wired to kind of, adapt to. And from that, 2 further numbers that emerge is that you'll generally have around 5 people that are really close to you and an outer circle of 15 people who are friends, and so on and so forth. And it seems that even there are nuances, because I'm pretty certain that in terms of how much he shaped your mind space, Rukun would be in that 5. But in terms of actually physically spending time together, hanging out, chilling, he'd probably be in the 15, if at all. Yeah. What is your sense of friendships over the years, and how do you, are you intentional about keeping friendships going, and how has your view towards friendship changed, especially in the course of writing the book, where you're actually writing about one?
No, so, this 5, 15 broadly applies to me, except there's an outer circle of maybe 500. And that's because of the circumstances of my life. So my life has, first of all, taken me for extended periods to different parts of India, and this is pre-liberalization and pre-India on the move, to use Chinmay Tambe's phrase. I grew up in Dehradun, studied in Delhi, did a PhD in Calcutta, now live in the South. I've traveled to different states in the course of my work. I lived abroad for extended periods, so I have American friends, Spanish friends, British friends, French friends, and I'm also naturally gregarious. So I'd say, yet, there would still be 8 or 10 people with whom I have this kind of long-lasting friendship. I mentioned one, Keshav Desiraju. I can mention another whom you should talk to if you haven't already, who is the educationist Rukmini Banerjee Pratham, who again is a college friend, and in fact I spoke to her just now before coming here, and a few others. There's a Spanish historian, a British biographer, whom I count in that. But Shekhar Pathak, the great Uttarakhandi historian, but I think friendships, and I always worry when a friend goes cold on me. I'm the person who establishes contact. I write and say, hey, what happened? I haven't heard from you. And even if the friend is behaving badly, I'll be doing the making up. So I think friendships have mattered a great deal to me. And of course, there's an ebb and flow. Sometimes you lose touch. Sometimes you regain touch. But yes, obviously, that Dunbar's number, which is the first time I've heard of that, which you quoted, is roughly right. I don't think one can have more than 15 really close friends in one's life.
And how do you think of friendships across age? Like a moving bit, and I wish there was more of it actually in the book, is about your friendship with Dharma Kumar, who was your cousin. The Rukun at one point referred to her as your aunt, but who was your cousin, and there were 30 years between you. And it seems that was also a beautiful, nurturing friendship. And one of my guests on a recent episode, but I've forgotten who because I'm growing old myself and my memory isn't great, lamented that, what he observes among younger people today is that there aren't so many friendships that go across age. And his point was that we should have friends who are 20 years older than us. We should have friends who are 20 years younger than us. And I myself find, great value in this because, you could be picking up different things from people in different generations. So what are your thoughts on that?
No,
do you have much younger friends?
That's a very rich insight. And it's possible that now you mention it, that friendships across generations have declined in recent years. And one reason for that could be the internet and the smartphone, because you're on your machine rather than meeting people, right? I actually have always had close friends who are older than me, less so younger than me. I've had young writers whom I like and who mail me and whom I mail, if I like something of theirs, I write to them. But it may be a deficiency in me. Dharma Kumar was extraordinarily generous towards young people, and that some of that comes from being a teacher. Unfortunately, I've only episodically taught in a university, and I think teachers may have a particular interest and aptitude for reaching out to young people.
You're also extremely, many people would say you're also generous to young people.
Yeah, no, I'm not disputing that, but in a different way. Like if someone sends me a manuscript, I'll comment on it and help them, improve it and possibly find a publisher. But actually, now that you ask this question and, you have encouraged me to be personal, if I was to think of people younger than me, significantly younger than me, with whom I've got really close friendships, obviously my two children will have to be excluded from this, I'd be hard put to name more than 4 or 5. And all of them would be a decade or so younger than me. So I'm now 65. And I'd be happy to name these people because I love them dearly. And you know some of them or know, if you don't know them, you know of them. So I'd say Naresh Fernandez would be one. And Nandini Sundar, the anthropologist, would be another. They're both about 10, 12 years younger than me. The great Tamil historian A.R. Venkatachalapathy would be a third. But not many more. The others are young writers I've been interacted with and maybe given feedback on their work and, out of admiration for their work. But there's been no long letters, no arguments, no confessions, no sentimentality. Naresh and Nandini are, I'm very, very close to them and I really admire them and I'm fond of them. And Naresh, of course, is impossible to fight with. But my friendship with Nandini, though she's only 10 years younger than me and Dharma was 30 years older than me, is a kind of replication of that. That it's a younger, older person and there's a quarreling and a kind of, there's a tension, but there's also great affection. But I can't think of someone in their 30s. And that could be that it could be many reasons for that. It could be that the older I've become more solitary in my attitude. It could be intimidating for people to reach out to an older and reasonably well-known writer. So, there are many young writers I admire. And as I said, I've worked with them and I love engaging with them. They're usually historians or non-fiction writers, and not always Indian. There's some people, For example, the historian Nico Slate, who's American, who's just written a wonderful biography of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, whom I've known from when he was a PhD student. Dinyar Patel. I mean, there are lots of other younger people, Arup Jati Sakyara, the Assamese historian, Akshay Mukul, Harish Damodaran, Sohini Chattopadhyay, who's written this lovely book on
Lovely book.
on runners, and I've been in conversation with her. But I'm not, maybe the fault is in me. It could be. It's a very interesting question you raised. I've never thought about it before. That why is it that when I was young, I befriended people who were 20 and 30 years older and became very close to them, and I haven't been able to successfully reproduce that in the same way. It could be, I think, maybe a character failing on my part. That or it could be that, and when I mean character failing, I also include an absolute obsession with one's work. Where I don't want to spend too much time hanging around with people because I want to focus on my work. And that comes at a cost to making new friends. So, yeah.
You're being too harsh, so I'll come up with an alternative explanation. I mean, your openness and generosity is something that, many have commented upon and I've experienced myself. But my alternative explanation also, and that leads to my next question, is perhaps a texture of our modern lives. Where, I'm in the middle of writing a newsletter post with the, tentative title, Trapped Inside the Infinite Scroll. But the texture of our modern lives involves that we don't engage deeply with reality, but are always skimming through it. We are scrolling, swiping, clicking. Everything is happening in bite-sized chunks, even though we have all the knowledge in the world available to us and, all of those riches. Whereas, when you and I were growing up, there was such a scarcity of books and knowledge around us, but our engagement was deeper. You sat down with a book, there was really nothing much to do. You would sit with it for 2 or 3 hours. And I feel that therefore the texture of your life, the texture of your thinking changes completely.
Also, absolutely. So also conversations. So when there was no smartphone, you would cherish the 2 hours you spent with someone, rather than texting them. Or when you're with them, you're looking at your phone and they're looking at their phone, right? So it's much more deep and intense and engaged, the conversations used to be. Well, it's absolutely, you're focused on one another, totally, right? And yeah, that could be part of it, yeah.
Is there a counterfactual world in which you and Rukun are young teenagers in this world of social media? Where do you go? Because Rukun, the recluse, could find a way to be social with so much of, where you don't actually have to meet people, but you can interact with them. And you, on the other hand, would be probably going out less, playing cricket less, etc.
Yes, I'm glad I grew up for all the advantages of the smartphone and easily available information and reaching people when there's an emergency and so on. I'm glad I grew up at a time when there was no television in my hometown. There was radio, and radio provides a very different window to the world because radio stokes and excites the imagination in a way in which the television and YouTube does not. So yes, it's. I remember these are childhood friendships, which of a kind which probably don't exist because there was no radio. Or occasionally there was a radio. I remember, for example, growing up in Dehradun, and I had 4 or 5 friends. They were all in different colleges. They would come home for the holidays. So I would come from Delhi, one would come from Pilani, one would come from Kanpur, and we were neighbors. And then we would go for walks in the evening. And I remember and we would chat about many things, usual things teenagers talk about. And there was one evening when, this is 1975, okay, it was a Wimbledon final. Arthur Ashe was playing Jimmy Connors. And we sat on a piece of grassy ground in Dehradun, looking out to the Himalayan foothills, listening to this match for 2.5 hours. And that was an epic match because Connors had made some, maybe not racist, but pejorative comments about Ashe. And Ashe would never look at him through that. And of course, the first black man to win Wimbledon. And what that experience would have done to our friendship, to the 4 or 5 of us who mainly. So yes, that kind of thing, you would have that watching a television set together, or let alone. So yeah, in a way, probably the world of the smartphone and the internet has made deep, engaged friendships more difficult, not impossible. But, in that sense, this book is an elegy to a world in which friendship was conducted differently. It's also an elegy to a world in which publishing operated on different principles. Yeah.
Your anecdote gives me a nice little segue into your friendship because one charming part of your book is where you wrote something about a match in which Richards and Lloyd had a partnership in the mid 70s. And I'll read out Rukun's reply because it's just so delightful.
It is
And
brilliant.
as it
Yeah.
happened, he was also at that match. And
Right.
30 years later, for people thinking I did this and I did that, then I think to find these common elements will be really hard.
Yeah.
But he was also at that match. And he wrote, quote, I like your descriptions of Clive Lloyd and Viv Richards. I too was at the Kotla, watching Viv hit all those sixes against Bedi and Co during his 190 or so. Exhilarating experience. I thought the central difference really between Lloyd and Richards was that Richards' stylish savagery was communicated by his face and body language. Everything about him spoke when he was being lethal. But with Lloyd, on the other hand, there was a hugely attractive gorilla-like languor, a cordial and impassive ease about that brutal batting he was dishing out, as though hitting a four was a form of politeness, like sipping tea. He seemed so inoffensive and so casually benign, even as he whiplashed all those balls flat to the ropes. To me, he communicated a philosophical rectitude on a job well done, something impersonal he was impartially executing, rather than anything personal against any particular bowler or team. That made him seem different and even more exalted than Viv Richards in a way, partly because most of the power batsmen, example Tendulkar, are more in the Richards and the Lloyd mold in the sense that they are so personally involved in their art and communicate that involvement through face and body. Lloyd seemed a kind of lama among batsmen. Stop quote. And he goes on, and
It's wonderful. Yeah.
it's a wonderful
I mean,
passage.
it's we talked earlier about this book I wanted to write on foreign cricketers, and this letter was in response to that book. And I'm glad I did not publish that book, but I'm glad I returned this letter because it's so vivid and so beautifully crafted. I mean, the llama among batsmen, that's what Lloyd was. Yeah, it's
And there's a beautiful line at the end about what else is cricket watching except emotions recollected as hype,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
such a lovely way to put it, and kind of tragic that, writing such as this should just be in a personal letter and not available for the world. And when I read this, and this comes pretty late in your book, so when I read this, I thought to myself that, yeah, everything that you've written about Rukun would made it seem that he was like a Lloyd and you were like a Richards, in
Yes,
terms of
yes.
kind of being reclusive, not really out there, and you got to do what you got to do, and and yet just imperious and so good. So
That's a nice analogy. I think Rukun would appreciate it.
tell me about how you met him. Tell me about college.
So there's something I don't talk about in this book because it would have spoiled the narrative. I first saw him on a badminton court. So this was 1974. I had finished, in those days when you finished school, if you had 6 months holidays before you joined college. So I wanted to join St. Stephen's. I finished school in December of 1973. And in January, I visited St. Stephen's to see my friend Akhilesh Kala, who makes a cameo appearance in this book, and he was showing me around the college. And we just went to the gym, and Rukun was playing badminton. And he was playing badminton. This is a sign of who he was playing with, of the time we then lived in. Which is why this book is also an elegy for, shall we say, the pre-Hindutva era of Indian intellectual and cultural life. He was playing badminton against a man called Rajan Habib Khwaja, a Hindu and a Muslim name, and and who was the son of Gandhian nationalists associated. His father was a professor and at one stage also a Congress MP. And I just remember them playing badminton, and Kala walked in. And Kala was a showman. He liked walking on his hands. So he started walking on his hands. And Rukun and Khwaja put down their rackets and started clapping. That was the first time I saw Rukun, which I don't mention in this book. And then 6 months later, I joined St. Stephen's, where, my first sight of him was as a badminton player. And within a week of my joining the college 6 months later, in July 1974, he was there was an aura about him because he was one of the two most brilliant people in the final year, the other being Shashi Tharoor. And they were both brilliant, both formidably well-read, both very erudite, both wrote elegant prose, and yet they were so spectacularly dissimilar in their personalities. And each had an aura of a different kind. Shashi was debating, wanted to be president of the college, and clearly was destined for great things. And Rukun was in his room listening to Beethoven, and a kind of elusive, enigmatic fellow who barely befriended anyone. So that was the first real memory I have of Rukun, was the reputation he had in college as a brilliant, reclusive, arrogant, and basically altogether antisocial and unfriendly man.
You've quoted these lovely lines by Amitav Ghosh on him, where Ghosh writes, The year I joined college, 1973, the word among us freshers was that the most terrifying ragger in college lived in Rudrakote in L5. Terrifying because he wasn't the usual kind of bullying, bellowing senior. No, he was to them as a panther is to the elephant, the Schmeater to the war club, the rapier to the broadsword. He was bearded, they said, and soft-spoken, so stealthy that you never sensed his presence until he had you square in his sights. Top coat. And, the bullying, bellowing seniors sound just like Viv Richards again. And they sound just like Lloyd. And of course, apparently, Amitabh and him got along really well because he took Amitabh to his room, as you describe, and played him some music, said, identify that, and he was able to identify most things.
Which I would not have been able to.
Which you would not have been able to. So,
99% of St. Stephen's College would not have been able to. So Amitabh was the charm circle of five who had knowledge of music or of poetry, and hence was befriended by Rukun.
And, from the outside, a person like this would also seem arrogant. Like you described one time where you were kind of, perhaps you mentioned might be the only time you spoke to him, that you were coming from somewhere and he was driving off on his scooter and you said hello and he just glared at you and drove off.
Yeah.
Right? And, so you would think like, who is this arrogant guy? Who the hell does he think he is? Etc., etc. So tell me about, how you actually thought of him, because what also happens is that when you look back, your recollection of that time can be colored by everything that you know subsequently of the person, which of course is a great relationship that you have. But at the time, what was it like? And at the time, from what you have come to know of him subsequently, what was he really like deep inside? Was he arrogant, or was he just, matter of fact, I just want to be with who I want to be with?
I think brilliant and unapproachable. I think that would be the way to describe him then, and possibly even now, and of course, with the occasionally vicious turn of phrase. I mean, sometimes very elegant, very beautifully put, but sometimes vicious, and that kind of remains. He's become slightly, I put it, till he was in his 40s, he would occasionally like to meet people, one-on-one or in groups of 2 and 3. He was never like parties. And but now I think he's absolutely withdrawn, except for his wife and whoever visits him in Ranikhet, and his dogs. And he's still, he's very close to some old friends. But I don't, except for Shekhar Pathak, I suspect he hasn't made a single new friend in the last 20 years.
How much of a part did his background have in shaping him? Because I'm fascinated by how his dad, Ram Advani, had that legendary bookstore in Lucknow and would go out of his way to help young people to shape their lives, as it were. You mentioned how someone finished an MA and he gave him a book specifically because he was so happy this young man had done well and wanted him to have that book. And it seems to me that when you later describe, he might not be like his father in the sense that he's out there in the public square and constantly, meeting all of these people who come to him and etc. But otherwise, he seems exactly like that in the sense that he's interested in people doing well. He's immersed in the world of ideas and he wants people to get ahead in that sense.
I think he was very proud of his father and what the father represented, as I quote Ira Pandey in on Ram Advani, an oasis of civility in an ever-changing, in a kind of city becoming rapidly barbaric, or something. She puts it much better. And he was proud of his father, also of his mother and his aunt. His aunt was a very respected teacher in Lucknow. And I saw a letter he wrote to his cousin when his aunt died, which was really deeply moving and showed how much he cared for, his parents and his aunt, who gave him an understanding of literature, of music, of, the word that we would always associate with a place like Lucknow, tamiz, which can't really be translated as civility or courtesy, but something more, and refinement of that kind. In fact, when his father died, he went to close up the store, and he found, since he knows I like biography, and he knows my son Keshava likes poetry, unlike me, he found the first edition of a biography of Byron, which he posted to us with an inscription which said, "To Ram and Keshava, from the ghost of Ram Advani." It showed that he obviously, admired his father and what the father represented, and as you say, in his own way, was carrying it on out in a different sphere. So, books, ideas, arguments, knowledge, a certain kind of integrity, along with attitude. I think that's what probably defines him.
I sort of wonder about the self-image and the interior life of people who are in a particular place where they see themselves as just as thinkers and, just in terms of how refined they are, just sort of a cut above the rest. And there are dangers that this could make you a little arrogant, or you could simply end up being more aloof. But then there is that question that how do you then see yourself? Because there is a tragedy in that you could see yourself as not fitting into this world, and that could take you into a particular direction. Or there is that sort of uneasy negotiation where you find your place in the world. And tell me a little bit about the sense that you get of him, having known him.
The latter. So I think, so he was a brilliant student. He got a gold medal, first class, first BA, first class for MA. And in those days, if you did that well, your old college offered you a job straight away as a lecturer. And he was obviously probably conscientious in class, but not that excited about meeting all these undergraduates. And then he went off to Cambridge and did a PhD. Cambridge is a beautiful place. He liked it. He wrote his doctoral thesis. And then he was offered a job by Ravi Dayal to join the OUP. And I think Ravi Dayal mattered a great deal to him. There was I spoke about the book in Bangalore last week. And someone who knew Ravi Dayal asked me, she said, from your talk, it doesn't appear as if there's as much about Ravi Dayal. And I said, there is some. But if Rukun was to write his memoir, it would be, he would write about Ravi Dayal the way I've written about Rukun and one or two of his teachers in college. Because Ravi Dayal was, unlike Rukun, more gregarious, utterly charming man. But like Rukun, devoted to producing high-quality works of scholarship. And he made OUP the force it was, and Rukun took it to the next level. But because Ravi recruited Rukun, Rukun found the calling that he loved most. He was a teacher, he was a writer, and then he became a publisher, which is what he was best at and which suited his temperament. And Ravi gave him the space to grow in the OUP. And then, of course, the OUP changed, and after 20 years, Ravi had a wonderful successor called Santosh Mukherjee. He was equally understanding of Rukun's gifts. He knew that Rukun would never wine and dine the authors, Rukun would never be, promoting them. But he was absolutely indispensable to maintaining the OUP's intellectual standards. So Ravi and his successor recognized that. A little later, the people who came after that were much more interested in the bottom line, and Rukun was at odds with them, and then he left and started his own publishing house. But by then he was established enough, worked with enough authors who so respected him that they migrated from the OUP to Permanent Black. But probably he found his calling and a way to fulfill his career as a publisher in a way that did not damage his personality, that was in keeping with his reclusive inward style, because of the space the OUP and particularly Ravi Dayal gave him in those early years. So, my book is about Rukun. So, I could not say, there are some paragraphs on what Ravi Dayal meant, but if Rukun was to ever write his memoir, I suspect that there would be two teachers, his undergraduate teacher Brijraj Singh and his postgraduate teacher A.N. Kaul, and Ravi Dayal, who would centrally figure in that book.
Actually, Ravi Dayal, you have written, I perhaps remember it as more substantive than you now say, because it painted such a vivid picture of him in my mind, particularly how when he had an office, he would not have an air conditioner in his cabin because he felt that everyone should work in the same circumstances.
That's a quote from Rukun, but.
Oh, that's a quote from Rukun. There you go. So I'll digress and ask a larger question here. In the past, in a different context of a broader history, we've spoken of the great man theory and so on and so forth. And here, again, I wonder if it sort of applies in the sense that you just spoke about the centrality of Ravi Dayal to Rukun, that Rukun might have been someone different, somewhere different, if not for Ravi Dayal. And you have certainly spoken, not just in the book, but elsewhere, about the centrality of Rukun to your own life.
Yes.
How he shaped you, all your books came out of him. I mean, there is a counterfactual in which if there is no Rukun Advani, we might not be sitting together.
Absolutely.
It's completely... So that's number one, that these individuals were so important and without them the course of life changes. And number two, it seems to me that these individuals are outliers, in the sense that later on, of course, you talk about the decay of publishing and all the things that happened. But it seems regardless of that in this narrative, that these are extraordinary people. and everyone they nurtured or came in touch with were really lucky that they existed, but they were outliers. They were not a type. They were not inevitable from the world around them. Like, I think of this often in the context of the community of economic reformers, in a sense that 91 was shaped by a community of economic reformers that worked together from the late 70s. Montek was brought here by Manmohan, a whole bunch of other people. And that carried on for about 20-25 years and then completely died out. And I did an 8-hour episode with KP Krishnan, perhaps the last of them recently. And my point to him was, you guys were outliers. It was not inevitable that you would emerge from the system. We are very lucky that you did. But now the system is what the system is, people responding to incentives. But to go back to that publishing thing, and the whole sort of the happenstances that have this particular individual exist in a particular place.
Yes.
And because of Ravi Dayal, he finds that perfect calling as a publisher, where he can he doesn't have to meet people all the time, but can immerse himself in the world of ideas and shape their work, which just seems like such a good fit.
Listening to you, if you think of Hindustani classical music, a subject about which I have some knowledge, I'm by no means an expert, but you see, you had princely patrons, and then the princely patrons started declining. And then you had some gurus who, 3 or 4, I suppose, Aladia Khan, from whom came all these great vocalists like, from Aladia Khan and his sons, vocalists like Mallikarjun and Kesarbai, and eventually Kishori, and even down to Ashwini Bide Deshpande, Alauddin Khan, without whom one would have not had Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar, above all, but also Pannalal Ghosh, the great flautist, and possibly Chaurasia and so on. So, the Chaurasia was trained by Alauddin's daughter, and one would have maybe Savai Gandharv, from where you get, and then, Abdul Karim Khan, who trained Bhimsen and Gangubai. So, I think, and they were not associated. I mean, Raja may have patronized them, but these 3 or 4 gurus, all operating in the 30s and 40s, at a time when the princely order was declining, and the radio was coming up to take the music of their disciples to a wider world. So someone could probably have to write a history of Indian classical music around this, wonderfully beneficent a coincidence of these 3 or 4 ustads,
You should write it.
But not me. I don't know enough about it. I'm just putting out the idea. I mean, I have a sense of sociology and history and to give somebody an idea, but I don't have by no means do I have remotely the musical or technical expertise to write it. So yes, obviously individuals play a much more important role. Not just great individuals. Rukun is not a great individual. He's just a very capable publisher. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and at one point, when Rukun is involved in a campaign to sort of save Peter Hees, a scholar from deportation, he writes about Hees that it was not patriotism that motivated me, though quite the opposite, a foster influence view of life in which the individual's fate is more important than the nation's, and even more important, when the individual is a decent underdog. Hees is a low-key scholar writing high-quality history for the love of it, sucking up to no one, never trying to thrust himself into the limelight for all the fine stuff he is writing quietly in the backwaters. And this sentence, low-key scholar writing high-quality history, seems to me in spirit to describe him himself.
Yes.
That he liked to be low-key, he didn't want to be in the limelight, he didn't want to write himself, but he just loved engaging with ideas, and he didn't care if it resulted in work for someone else. And in your life you have come across many people, I'm sure, who are either shapers or creators themselves, and he seems like a quintessential shaper who was simply happy that way, and you've in a sense played both roles.
So Alauddin, these gurus I've talked about would be them. I mean, the hardly recordings of Aladia Khan. There's the odd recording of Alauddin Khan, but barely, right? So they would have played the kind of nurturer, shaper role. And so would many teachers, across generations, not just in music, but, in other professions. Since I'm talking about my life and my work, I think I should put it on record that Rukun, I've written a whole book about Rukun, because he's played an important role in my life and because I have these 40 years of correspondence. But there are at least 3 other people who possibly have played equivalent roles in shaping me. And then I'll answer your question. And I'll briefly mention them. One is my wife, Sujata. That's a personal thing. So if what a spouse can mean to you, if it's a sustaining and happy relationship is something one would not want to, trivialize by talking about it. It's really very deeply personal. But there are two other people. One is my first teacher, who is briefly mentioned in this book, who was a man called Anjan Ghosh. And I'm privileged in some ways because I was middle class, I was English speaking, but I'm not privileged in other ways. In that, by the standards of Indian scholarship, if you look at all the leading Indian historians and political scientists and sociologists, they either studied abroad or studied at JNU or Delhi University. I did a PhD in sociology in the most unlikely place, an Institute of Management, which had a small, unglamorous, not very good sociology department. But when there was one young, brilliant scholar called Anjan Ghosh, who took me step by step through the classics of sociology, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, the classics of social anthropology, taught me the craft of research, encouraged me to be interdisciplinary, to be a sociologist, to learn from history and from literature, to go into the field. And without him, I could not have written a single book. Now, I don't have that archive of correspondence to write about him. Another person who played an equally important role in my life was the late editor of the EPW, Krishnaraj, who published my first essays when I was again unknown. Now, patrons play such an important role in the academy. I quote M.N. Srinivas asking me who was writing the foreword to your book, thinking I have a patron. And I think, because these three or four people, Krishnaraj, the editor of EPW, my first teacher, Anjan Ghosh, Rukun, and support I got from my family, including my father, not just my wife, I think allowed me to overcome the barrier of a indifferent academic record to become a published scholar. I think some of what I have done since in, working with younger people is recognizing how lucky I have been in having, if I look at my peers, they studied with great philosophers in Princeton, in Harvard, historians in Cambridge. And they still mention it. The other day I was reading a CV of someone just a little younger than me, and that person mentions who they did their PhD with, because 30 years later you want to say I did my PhD with some superstar, right? No, I had none of that. I was privileged in other ways. I was middle class, I was a Brahmin, I was male, I spoke English. But Anjan Ghosh, Rukun and Krishnaraj made me a public scholar, and the debt I owed them is so colossal and irredeemable that at least I can do a little bit by, any young writer or scholar who has a book idea, which I think I can provide some modest assistance with. I think it's my obligation.
Tell me a little bit about Anjan Ghosh, because I read about him in the book and I thought I must ask Ram to elaborate because I was curious. Tell me a little bit about him.
Well, yeah. So it's like this. I don't know how much of this will interest your listeners. It might be really very self-indulgent. But when you think of chance and accident, Anjan Ghosh grew up in Calcutta, did a first degree in literature, then went to JNU, where it was just established, to do an MA in sociology. He was regarded as one of the two most brilliant young sociologists of his generation, the other being a person whom you surely know of, who is Shiv Vishwanath. So Anjan was in JNU, Shiv was in Delhi University. They were contemporaries doing their PhDs together, regarded as the rising stars of Indian sociology. And then Anjan's father died, and he was an only child, so he had to go back to be with his mother, only son, to go back with his mother in Calcutta and take the first job he got, which was in a management institute, which was totally uncongenial compared to Delhi, where he was flourishing. And actually, it was when I got interested in sociology, it was Shiv Vishwanathan who told me that the Delhi school will not give you admission because your grades are bad, but my friend Anjan is in Calcutta, try there. So here he was stuck in Calcutta, the backwater of sociology, in a management institute where what was valued was marketing and finance and computer science, and in a city where sociology was regarded as a bourgeois science, because Marxists actually had officially classified sociology as a bourgeois science. And for the reason that Marx talked about political economy and historical materialism, which meant history, politics, and economics were kosher, but sociology was a bourgeois science. It was officially classified as such. So it was a completely inhospitable intellectual environment for him. And then I turned up at his doorstep, the only student in the department, and so he just pours out all his energy and enthusiasm at me. I mean, he has at least someone to nurture. Whereas in Delhi, he would have had hundreds of colleagues and peers and teachers and students. So 4 years, we talked almost every day for what I was reading, what he was reading, what he was writing. He got my first articles published. And then, of course, some years later, he died of cancer. He died in his 50s, not that young, but before he could really fulfill his own intellectual potential. So, without him, as I said, I would not have written a single book. He really made me a scholar. Rukun published the books and made them even better through his editing. But the transition from a indifferent economist to a keen and energetic sociologist was really overseen by Anjan Ghosh.
Something that I got a deeper sense of while reading the book, and this is another digression, but we'll come back to Rukun. But, since you mentioned Anjan being in Calcutta in this relatively obscure sort of institute, something that I got a deeper sense of during this book was really how much of an outsider people like you and Rukun were, in the sense that the Marxist historians dominated everything. You've got this fantastic passage where Ranajit Guha, lectures to a hall full of Marxist historians, and somebody asks a question and he kind of comes back at them. But at this time, you were, despite being a student in what is a serious subject, the subject of sociology, you are outside the mainstream of academia. No one really takes you seriously at all. Everybody has their prisms of looking at the world. You have to fit into their theories of class warfare and conflict and etc., etc. And how was it navigating that? Because on the one hand, you are having to navigate as someone who used to play cricket and has now come into academia. You must have had so many self-doubts and you must have questioned yourself so much that am I cut out for this and etc., etc. And at the same time, even if you were cut out for that, given the discipline that you have chosen, you are still an outsider within the system. Give me a sense of what that was like for both you and in a certain sense Rukun as well, because he also did not regard himself as part of that set. He completely
I can't speak for Rukun, but I think maybe there was, I think it was the discovery of the Chipko movement and environmentalism that made me realize that just as Marxism had dismissed sociology as a bourgeois science, it dismissed environmentalism as a bourgeois deviation from the class struggle. And my travels to the Himalaya and the recognition that, contrary to what was believed both among the Marxist left and the free market right, that environmentalism was a luxury a poor country could not afford. Actually, it was even more vital to the sustainable, careful management of natural resources like air and water and forests and pasture were absolutely vital to the livelihood of hundreds of millions of Indians. So I think that was a kind of an epiphany and gave me a purpose that I will be a historian of the environment. That was really my first field of research, and then I moved on to other things. And then I acquired the self-confidence, and particularly after Krishna Raj published my papers in EPW, and they got some attention because no one had worked on this before. I think then I was, and maybe I always had, I don't know how that came. I think it came from the confidence of having discovered my calling, that I would do what I wanted to do.
There are these beautiful lines from Rukun where he talks about the intelligentsia, and they are so powerful that which he wrote in a letter to you. So I'll actually quote it because you put it in your book. So I'll quote it. Why not? Yeah. The trouble with the narrow-minded, blinkered, bureaucratized, malicious and petty semi-intelligentsia of this fucked up country is that the moment someone writes well in an informal, freewheeling manner on unacademic subjects, as you do, and he's talking to you, obviously, letter to you, his virtuoso writerly virtues are used to cast doubt on his equal and separate credibility as a first-class academic. These chutias talk about the desirability of blurring distinctions and categories, but when someone blurs the distinctions between the academic and the unstuffily popular, they feel hugely uneasy and threatened and uncomfortable, which is because these bastards can't blur that distinction themselves and subconsciously know they can't. In short, if an academic casts doubt on your caliber as an academic on the grounds that you have written well on cricket, they do the same with Mukul Kesavan on the grounds that he can write wonderfully on Hindi movies. Take it as a compliment and tell them to stuff their stuffed shirt comments up their asses, stop quote. And this passage literally stands out because, dear listener, Gunadwani does not write like this from what I can make out from the rest of the book or his other writing that I've read. But this is such a delightfully candid explosion, mincing no words.
So, several readers have said that they're glad I've quoted so extensively from Rukun. because it gives them a sense of what a wonderful stylist he is, and also gives them a sense of sadness that there's not more of him in the public domain, because he used to write for newspapers and he completely stopped 20 years ago. But I'd say, reflecting on that passage and also on the questions you asked before, I think the people I admired as a young man, as a young scholar, worked on the margins of the academy. So Elwin, it was reading Verrier Elwin which inspired me to move from economics to sociology. And Elwin wrote many books, had an honorary D.Phil from Oxford, but never had a university job, and was partly scorned by academics because he wrote so well. Then later on, when I moved to history, my first hero and relatively long-lasting hero was the great historian E.P. Thompson, who also only episodically had a university job. And then when I got interested in the social history of cricket, I stumbled upon C.L.R. James, who wrote major works of historical scholarship without a PhD and without a university job. So I think it so happened that many of the people I admired, I mean, to that list of Elwin, Thompson, and James, I should add two more who played an important role in my intellectual evolution. One was the American environmental scholar and urban theorist Louis Mumford, and the last was the Indian naturalist M. Krishnan, whom I grew up reading. And all wrote major works of non-fiction, stroke scholarship, in most cases, without having a PhD. In fact, in all cases, without having a PhD, and certainly though I had a PhD, without holding a university job. And I think choosing the exemplars like that made me, shall we say, more defiant, less caring about academic convention and academic procedure and academic language. And I reflect on this pantheon of 5 heroes, because the one lesson I took from them, cautionary lesson, is that all 5 of them were principally historians, cultural critics, broadly non-fiction writers and scholars, but all 5 of them at some stage in their career wrote a novel. And their novels all bombed. And I think that's among the reasons I will never, venture into fiction, as I describe in this book.
You describe in the book about how you almost wrote a novel, and then I think you read something by Mukul, and you said, I can't write as well as
It was
that.
a conversation with Mukul. He was actually telling me, describing something else. I could never do this.
Yeah. No, I think that's a terrible reason. You should, I don't know whether it would have been good or bad, but I wish you'd done it, because why not sort of stretch yourselves? On a related note, I remember I accidentally stumbled into a job in Wisdom, which later became Cricinfo back in the 80s. And I remember that somebody asked me that, why didn't you, become a full-time cricket writer and just focus on that? And my answer was because I read Rahul Bhattacharya. Because Rahul Bhattacharya was just so remarkable that I thought that, oh my God, I can never do that.
Yes.
And the reasoning is kind of silly, because everything has its own place. I recognize that now, but it was a glib line that, so this sort of reminded me of that. I want to continue down the line of what we were talking about and ask about India's intellectual life. Like, where does an intellectual ecosystem come from? Like, I do the show on YouTube now called Everything is Everything with my friend Ajay Shah, and we had an episode called Fixing the Knowledge Society. And Ajay's central thesis was that there was a time where universities were the center of the world of knowledge. That is where knowledge was produced, that is where knowledge was sought for, that is where knowledge was disseminated, and that public purpose and the function that it performed in society is completely lost. Our universities across the world have degenerated completely, have become prey to fads and fashions and so on and so forth. And exactly like everything that Rukun described in that passage I quoted out applies so vividly for me today. And I can see that fine, through these strokes of luck, someone like you emerges, and, you speak about how for Permanent Black you edited the Indian Century. Writers like, Srinath Raghavan, Nirja Gopal Jayal, their books came out in that. So there is a generation of people doing really good work. But at the same time, I feel our intellectual ecosystem is so incredibly lacking in depth and quality. Like, you'd once written an essay for Caravan where you'd spoken about how the right-wing ecosystem, there were no thinkers at all. And of course, I kind of agree. But it seems that even overall, that kind of holds. How many intellectuals of a quality are there, and where does an intellectual ecosystem then evolve from if the universities have failed us?
So, Amit, the universities became inward-looking, self-absorbed, jargonized, chasing fashion rather than true in-depth scholarship. I mean, I'm talking about the humanities and social sciences. So all that is true. But now the danger comes from elsewhere. It comes from the political class and the regime that rules us, that is profoundly hostile to ideas and debate and reflection and critical thinking. And even the small centers of reasonable work that were going on in Delhi and other places have been basically destroyed by this regime. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other is, of course, with WhatsApp and social media, everyone is their own economist, their own sociologist, their own historian. And clearly, you need to democratize knowledge, but you need to decertify deep research, critical thinking, original sources in the way that's happened now. So it at least humanities and social sciences, the world over, are in a crisis for multiple reasons. And university professors are only partly to blame. There are also larger political, technological, cultural forces at work that are undermining the quality of scholarship.
Yeah, and what you said about, how a particular regime may clamp down, earlier we discussed how it's just happenstance that you have individuals like Ravi Dayal and this thing. And equally, it is happenstance that there's a great institution like CPR. So when you gut
Yes,
that institution,
absolutely.
the damage it does is huge. It is
Absolutely.
enormous. There is work that would not exist today without them. And there is future work that
Absolutely.
will not come into being.
Absolutely. And the Delhi School of Economics, now many of the appointments are basically on political considerations, things like that. Absolutely. Yeah. And also, it's probably not entirely germane to this conversation. One of the less known aspects of this regime's attack on intellectual work is the undermining of our best scientific institutions by putting pro-Sanghi directors. I mean, the government now more or less vetoes who can become an IIT director based on their political stroke, cultural stroke, religious views. So that's deeply worrying.
That's deeply worrying. Let's take a quick break, and on the other side of the break, let's continue. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST, or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just a willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Ram Guha about his wonderful book, The Cooking of Books, which is not about accounting and how you do financial frauds, but instead about a deep personal friendship. And, going back to Rook, firstly, I'm delighted that you quoted so much from his letters to you, because they gave us a sense both of how intensely he shaped your work and also what a fine thinker he was. And it struck me that in a lot of that writing, there is obviously no self-consciousness at all, because he is writing to a friend. And that makes the writing even better, in the sense that wherever you quote it from things that have appeared in the public and all of that, it feels like here's someone making an effort to be witty or to be smart, because people are going to read them, and there's that self-consciousness. But some of these letters are just magnificent. They are so eloquent, they so perfect at points that they cannot possibly be edited. And it's just a remarkable intellect at work. And yet so how do you think that plays out? Because I was kind of teasing these thoughts in our head, that was there then an anxiety of, when he's around other people, and does writing in public sort of reproduce that kind of anxiety, in a sense that he thinks he has to be impressive, etc., because the writing otherwise is...
I mean, I can't answer on his behalf, but there's a performative aspect to writing. You want to impress, you want to shock, you want to startle, you want to amuse, and because it's for a larger audience. A letter is just yourself expressing your thoughts to someone you love and like, and it's not supposed to be by anyone else. And both the good and the bad in the writing of rukun, public writing of, shall we say, if I may list a few names, both the good and the bad in the public writing of Shashi Tharoor, Rukun Advani, Mukul Keshavan, Upamanyu Chatterjee, Ramachandra Guha, Chopin Das Gupta. I mean, a wide variety of males, and I'm deliberately mentioning only males. A lot of this can be attributed to the college in which they studied, which was about wit, argument, contestation in public. Amitav Ghosh's writing is an exception. Alan Seeley's writing is an exception. There are two Stephenian writers who are maybe from the beginning, they only accidentally went to St. Stephen's. I mean, their writing was not really, and their style of argument and their polemic and their wordplay. So that's part of it. I mean, there are aspects of the Stephenian prose style that are charming and evocative, and there are aspects that are just dreadful. I mean, it's this love of alliteration, PJs, bad jokes. So I think maybe that's what it is, because you're writing to impress a fellow Stephenian, rather than writing what you think. And I think that's how I would express it. Yeah.
And it also seems in his editorial notes to you that not only is he adding a great deal and making suggestions about where you could take a particular narrative or what you could look at, what he is also doing is that he's actually cutting down a lot of the BS. Like, I don't remember the particular example, but there is this particular example where you had like a clause, you had half a sentence about, where you were being witty. I think it is about Warrior Elvin being called Bare Bhai by the tribals.
Not Big Brother in the Orwellian sense.
Yeah, and you had half a line about is not Big Brother in the Orwellian sense, and he was like, stop showing off, that is obvious. And he made you cut that half line out.
That's right.
And it would seem that then he has an eye for that in your writing and is, kind of...
And in other people's writings too. Yeah.
So, tell me a little bit then about that, how your writing evolved, how your work evolved as a consequence of knowing him. Because one of the things that I seem to see is, and I think you mentioned it somewhere, that you were so in awe of him or you respected him so much that you would defer to him always. If he would say, cut this out, you would cut it out. And obviously from all the chunks that you reproduce, he's giving you great reasons and all of it makes sense. But at the same time, he is shaping you. And there is a lot of good in that shaping, that it is expanding your worldview and showing you things about your own writing that you may not have seen. But there are also dangers in it, because I think sometimes you have to let young people play their shots, as it were, make their mistakes, find their own paths. And there is a part dependence to encouraging them to think in a particular way also. So in the, when you look back at the trajectory of your intellectual development and your development as a writer with him, how do you feel?
So I think, Rukun was not micromanaging my prose. He was expanding the range of my interests and maybe shaping the way a essay or a book was structured, cutting out the fluff. But the prose style was mine. And so that sense, my PhD thesis was written under the supervision of Anjan Ghosh and my co-supervisor Kamini Adhikari, and Rukun had nothing to do with it. But he read it and he said, there should be more on women. The stuff on the bravery of hill soldiers in the footnote, put it up front. Give some larger context about the landscape. So he was working with what he saw, appreciating its virtues, not trying to homogenize it and make it sort of uniform in a Time magazine or India Today kind of style, but pushing you in new directions. So he was, with other writers, he may have rewritten much more, because there would have been other writers for whom writing was not so comfortable or easy. I think where he particularly helped me was in my Elvin biography, because a biography is the most difficult of literary genres, at least when it comes to non-fiction. It's far easier writing a work of social history, political history, travel, even autobiography, because to get a person's life in the round, both their private life and their public life, to properly sketch out the other characters, in their journey, their parents, their siblings, their friends, their rivals, their lovers, their own children, and to do so in both a scrupulously honest way, but also while recognizing that a life is lived in context with other lives, so the relationships come out. Too many biographers just write about their main characters. People write on Gandhi purely on the basis of Gandhi's collected works, so it's only Gandhi's point of view. And I think that's where he really helped me. But, and also giving me ideas. I mean, one of the letters, when I reread this book, I mean, after it was published, one of the letters that really stood out, written by Rukun to me, was in 1987. I was in Bangalore. I'd come back from Yale. I was working here. And I write to him saying, I've started resuming playing cricket with a club here. And you might think the sociologist has regressed to becoming the cricketer you knew in college. And he writes back saying, not at all. Why don't you write as a sociology of cricket? And this is what it should be about. Look at how the game has changed. Who's watching it? Who's playing it? How cricketers are coming from different backgrounds? How the game is being funded? How the fan base is changing? And no one has written about all of this. Why don't you write about it? And effectively, that's what I did many years later. So the germ of the idea of my book, A Column of Fallen Field, was planted by Rukun. But he saw someone who was passionate about cricket as a young college student, who had later become a sociologist, and who could now marry his professional training and his personal passion into a social history of cricket. So he saw it that long ago. And so that's what a great editor does. A great editor is, I don't know, a kind of entrepreneur too. I won't say venture capitalist, but maybe, put a person and an idea together and say, why don't you just go for it? That's what Peter Strauss did later on for me with India After Gandhi. I had no idea I would ever write that book. And he comes to me and says, why don't you write a history of independent India? But in terms of my writing style, large or my prose style, I think it was already there before I met Rukun. It was further refined, further shaped. But he wasn't rewriting what I wrote. He was encouraging me to go in new directions, to probe deeper, and to take on new and more challenging subjects.
You begin your book with this wonderful quote by Norman Podhoretz about editors, where you write, where he says, quote, good editors, really good editors are very rare. In fact, even rarer than good writers. It is a special kind of talent because it takes two qualities that rarely go together in the same person. On the one hand, great arrogance, and on the other hand, great selflessness. The arrogance lies in the fact that you, the editor, thinks he knows better than the author, who is usually a specialist, on how to say what it is he wants to say. The humility or selflessness, which is very important, is that you are willing to lend your talents to someone else's work without getting any credit for it. Stop quote. And it therefore seems to me that this almost, is there a particular kind of person who is rarely like this? Because to my mind, if you're incredibly smart, if you're incredibly, like you said, he was not an expert just in language, but in thought, he had a PhD from Cambridge. For someone like that, and to look at relatively less sort of, colleagues who were probably not at the same level, like Shashi Tharoor going out there and writing all these novels and making a name for themselves. And it would have been, irresistible to kind of write yourself and join that sort of league of people. But he never did that. And it seems both a little baffling to me, and at the same time, I completely get it. And so what is sort of your sense of that? Like, what would his self-image have been like? How did he see himself? Was he never tempted by he did write Beethoven Among the Cows and so on. But, what is
he was tempted. And so after he wrote Beethoven Among the Cows, I remember chatting to him. And he said he wants to write a novel from a female point of view, with a female character as the main protagonist. And he had thought of it, but clearly never wrote it. He was also a very fine essayist. I still remember 30 years later, a long review he wrote of Robert Canigal's biography of the mathematician Ramanujan. And the review started by saying, in the year, 1910, two of the greatest scholars in Cambridge, independently, without knowing of the other, got letters from unknown people. Russell, the greatest philosopher of his time, got a letter from an Austrian, which he looked at and said, is this guy a crank or is he a genius? And a few months before, I forget, he had the chronology right, mathematician, Hardy, the greatest British mathematician of his time, got a letter from an unknown Indian, and he looked at it and said, is this guy a genius or is he a crank? Now, this was Wittgenstein writing to Russell and Ramanujan writing to Hardy. And in both cases, the great Cambridge professor decided to give this person the benefit of the doubt and to punt, to take a chance and invite them. And in each case, the protege outstripped the teacher or the mentor. Now, only Rukun could have drawn this comparison because of his scholarship. And so, that sense, it must be reckoned a pity that he stopped writing for public consumption. He could have still written all these letters, he could have still shaped all these books and nurtured all these young writers, which he continues to do. But for whatever reason, he decided that he would just stop writing. And I have some speculations, but they're not well founded, so I should not share them, as to why he simply stopped writing for the public.
At one point where you refer to your doctoral thesis period, you write, quote, while Rukun's doctoral thesis was an example of literature from above, mine was an illustration of history from below, right? And that seemed to me to be very striking, especially because what history from below indicates is that you have to put in a heck of a lot of work to actually get there. You can't really sit there and you might have read a lot and you might know, oh, Wittgenstein wrote to Hardy and so wrote to so and so. But to write the kind of books that you went on to write, it's really a question of, sitting your butt on the chair and putting in all of this work. And that might not be congenial for someone who just wants to live in a world of ideas, but not necessarily do all the dirty work.
I mean, you have to, if you're a historian, you have to, or an anthropologist, you have to love the research. So anthropologist means living in a working class community or in a, or even if you're, now you will have ethnographies of IT companies. So living for a year with people and talking to them and observing them. If you're a historian, it means going to the archives. It means seeing, for example, when I wrote my first book on peasants and forests in the Himalaya, it meant not only looking at government records unpublished, but also runs of Hindi newspapers, week after week, to look at them on microfilm and see what they are saying about, Garhwali peasants in the 30s and the 40s and 50s, and then taking notes. So without that industrious hard labor in the archives or in the field, you can't really begin even to construct a narrative or tell a story. Whereas if you're a literary scholar, you just take a book from the library and, pass it and analyze it and gloss it. And yes.
Tell me also about then how you came at your work ethic, because, in your book, you have this detailed section about how for the Elvin book, you wrote 4 or 5 drafts practically from scratch, and which involved not just a hard work, which I marvel at, that you just put your bum on that chair every time and you get the job done, but also the humility of being open that something I have worked on for so long is not working, and I should have the brutality to take it up and tear it again and start again. So tell me about how you kind of arrive at that, because for a lot of lesser people, lesser minds, people who accomplish much less, people like me, it's very tempting that you write something and you think that, oh wow, this is so great, and it breaks your heart to touch it. But, you somehow kind of manage to do that. Take me a bit through that.
I mean, in terms of work ethic, I think it has something to do with my having been a cricketer. And only a moderately good cricketer. So bowling 3 hours in the nets, trying to get Arun Lal or Kirti Azad out, because they were the 2 people who were in my team who played for India. I'm just mentioning them. There were other very good batsmen too. You have to strive very hard. And all through my life, when I, of course, I've enjoyed my work. It's not drudgery. But I go to an archive, I go at 9, I take a break at 1, and I go back to my desk at 2:30, and then I'm there till the archive closes at 5, taking notes from files. And I don't like taking photographs or photocopies. I just like taking notes so that I assimilate much better. And when I'm back in my study in Bangalore, I'm at my desk, not the whole day, but from 9:30 to 1:30 writing. Now, so it may have come from having, what a cricketer does is very different from what a historian does, but having spent 8 or 9 years of my youth absolutely devoted to trying to become proficient at a sport in which I was never really proficient. I was an ordinary college cricketer. That's it. I never really graduated to anything better than that. But I gave everything to wanting to play cricket and wanting to play it to the best of my abilities. And I think that has remained with me. So I think I know other examples of people who played a sport when they were young and then migrated to some other profession, and then I think also had this ethic. I think playing a team sport is particularly valuable because it's not about yourself. You fail, but your team wins. In terms of writing and rewriting, I think even my columns, I rewrite. And I always print out what I write. And I often tell young people that don't think you can edit on the screen. You can edit a bit on the screen, but you need a physical copy to see how the narrative flows, where it stumbles, where it may be repetitive, where it may be confusing, unclear. So I've written now a fortnightly column for 25 years. It used to be a weekly column, it's now fortnightly, and I always revise and print out. And I try usually to write it 2-3 days in advance, so it has the benefit of 2-3 revisions. I think that's extremely important. So that's really, and the last thing I again tell young people when they ask me is never have your mobile phone with you while you're writing or reading.
The one difference that strikes me between cricket and writing is that in cricket you get that immediate feedback loop.
Yes.
You can't hide, you know how good you are. You go out there on the field, you have a great
Yes,
bowler
absolutely.
bowling at you. There's no place to hide. Doodh ka doodh, pani ka pani, as it were, as the saying goes. And in writing, it often isn't like that. Sometimes you have no idea. Sometimes you are too harsh on yourself. Sometimes you are not harsh enough on yourself.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there is the added complexity. Like I often tell my writing students that if you write something that you do not like, it is a reason to continue, not to stop, because all it means is that your judgment is more evolved than your ability. And it's just endless iteration that eventually, makes your ability catch up with your judgment. But as regards to judgment itself, how was it for you? Because you were an outsider in a field that itself was an outsider among other fields. And how would you possibly kind of know? Like at one point, I think in the mid 90s, you quote from this letter that you write to Rukun, where you say, I am increasingly coming round to the opinion that the only thing I can do well, as distinct from competently, is write about cricket. My depression these past weeks has been terrific. Stop quote. And I felt heartbroken when I read that, frankly. And thank God that, Rukun replied, you do tend to oscillate in a somewhat extreme manner for something and despair over the same thing. So I'm reading that despondence over Elvin as a pendulum swing, which will soon go in the right direction. And indeed it did. So thank God for that. But how would you sort of deal with this? Because I think what a lot of young writers, young scholars often face is this extreme self-doubt, the imposter syndrome, and frankly, women feel it far more than men. And then how do you even evaluate yourself in what is a sea of content and a sea of judgment floating all around you?
So I'll try to answer that question, but that letter you read out where I say in 1995, the only thing I feel I can write competently about is cricket. 30 years later, I think that's the only thing I cannot write competently about. People often ask me why we stopped writing about cricket. And that's because I started writing about cricket as we, in an era, as you discussed earlier in this conversation, where there was no television. And where you had to recreate an image of how G.R. Viswanathan played the square cut, or Sunil Gavaskar played the straight drive, or Prasanna bowled the straighter one. Now, that's all there. You can see it. And my style of writing is as extinct and as irrelevant as the dodo, right? So I can't write about cricket anymore. People often ask me, and the reason is, if Bishan Bedi dies, I'll write a short tribute because I admired him. But even that wouldn't have the. I still believe that it wouldn't have the kind of flavor and energy and youthful exuberance of my early writings on cricket. So I cannot write competently about cricket, but I think I can write competently about history and politics and biography and so on. And a lot of that is to do with experience. The older you get, the more you practice your craft. And historians, fortunately, can go on to a much older age than, shall we say, mathematicians who kind of peak at 23 or 25. Hobsbawm was writing great works of history into his 80s. And so that's. But I also do have a feedback loop. I think you're right that as a cricketer, you know immediately when somebody hits you for a six that was a bad ball. It may be a lucky shot, but more likely it was a bad ball. And you have colleagues to tell you, to how to change your approach to that particular batsman. Now, of course, you have a whole support staff and computer analysts and video analysts. But I also do have a feedback loop. So, and it depends on the book I'm writing. So I've just finished a book which will be out towards the end of the year, which is a return to my first field of research. It's a history of Indian environmental thought, starting with Tagore and ending with a writer in the 1970s. So kind of a pre-Chipko history of thinking about the environment in India. And there were half a dozen environmental scholars, of whom the bulk were actually not Indians, whom I got to read it, and who provided me immensely valuable feedback. For my journalism, if I'm confused or not sure about my argument, now it is generally my wife or my children who will have a look at it and always improve it. So I think you know with experience whom to trust for what particular piece of writing, and you must not be afraid to share it with them with two caveats. The first is you should never show it to too many people. I think this book went through 13 drafts because it needed it. But my other books would go to 3 or 4 people I trust. If it's a biography, the British historian David Gilmour would always be my first reader because he's a magnificent biographer, and 1 or 2 other people, depending on what the topic is about. And you must finally trust, the second caveat is you must finally trust your own judgment or based on what you get. But it's very different for a novel because I think novelists have a much more difficult life because it's much easier being a historian than a novelist because you're in command of your data, your research, your sources, your argument. You know what's there. You know who has written on Gandhi, so what can you add to what they've written on Gandhi? Whereas if you're a novelist, you can't say I'm writing against Tolstoy or Dickens. You have no basis for comparison or for judging how good your work is. So there are a few people I would always, any important piece of writing, it used to be Rukun. Now I don't burden Rukun too much because there are other things on his plate. Occasionally I still run something by him. And of course, there are also some good editors around the place. I mean, I find that magazine editors in India are not generally very good. But overseas, whenever I write for the Financial Times, which is very rarely, about once a year, I get fantastic feedback. And they always improve my articles.
Tell me about the evolution of the publishing ecosystem in all of these years, because it appears from the descriptions that, in the 70s, it's a little bit of a cottage industry. There are these committed individuals like Ravi Dayal who are building something around themselves, and that is one strain of what is going on. But then the 90s, India opens up, Penguin comes here, and things get corporatized and things go in a sort of a different direction. Like even the definition of editor, as you point out, it was Rukun who commissioned you, and Rukun who went through all your text and shepherded your books to where they went and even shaped your books in a sense. Like earlier, when you said that they're a little bit like venture capitalists, actually I completely agree that that's what a good editor is, that you're planting 100 ideas and then out of that one will take shape and become something great. So it is exactly the same kind of thinking. But tell me a little bit about how that ecosystem changed. I mean, luckily by the time it changed, you were already a grandee of sorts, so it wouldn't have affected you personally. But you saw the change, and many of the changes were unedifying, like your descriptions of what happened in OUP, which forced Rukun to leave, which was just petty politics playing out under other pretexts.
I think clearly, when I say I have a criticism of Rukun in a footnote where I say, but permanent black, world class in editing, but not in marketing and publicity. Right? So clearly, books have to be sold. Rukun has a magisterial disregard for making his books more visible, more known, and some of his authors have rightly complained about that. On the other hand, you have people who simply treat books as, FMCG, fast moving, and don't think of quality or how long a book endures. OUP was important because it kept books in print. Now, for example, the death of OUP, what that has meant is, if somebody today writes, shall we say, since we are in Karnataka, a biography of say a great Kannada writer, Shivaram Karan, or Ramakrishna Hegde or Devarajars, 2 of our most important chief ministers. Or to take other states, somebody writes on EMS Namboodiripad, who ran the first democratically elected communist government anywhere in the world and had a very transformative impact on his state, which is 30, 40 million people. Now, Penguin or Harper would publish that book. They won't give it the same attention that the OUP editors would have done. It'll sell 3,000 copies in the first year, and 3 years later you can't find it. Whereas OUP would keep that book alive. It would not sell 3,000 copies in the first year, it would only sell 750. But 15 years later, if you wanted to know more about the history of communism in Kerala, that book would be available. Right? And that's the job of a scholarly publisher, to both improve the quality of the writing and the research and the presentation, and to keep it alive. The job of a commercial publisher is to sell many copies quickly. And they're complementary. I mean, some books can serve both purposes, but not all. I mean, Eric Hobsbawm's books still sell, and they're first-class works of scholarship. Amartya Sen would be another person who's kind of bridged that gap. But broadly, you need both kinds of publishers. And I'm glad that you have Penguin and Harper and Westland and Aleph and all of them to nurture young writers. But I think sometimes the kind of, in terms of scholarly writing and scholarly publishing, I think there's an acute deficiency in India today after the death of OUP. I mean, like, if you look at some of the names and how they transformed our understanding of what India is all about. I mean, Ashish Nandi, Veena Das, Ramila Thapar, M.N. Srinivas, Andre Bete, Subaltern Studies, Partho Chatterjee, Nirja Jayal. Now, Permanent Black does some of that, but not enough. I mean, OUP had a establishment. It had warehouses in every major city, so it could at least partially compete with the commercial presses in getting their books out. And that is, as the death of OUP has hurt the world of ideas in India. I mean, it's dealt it a body blow.
So I'm just thinking aloud here, but earlier we were talking about, the intellectual ecosystem and agreed that universities have kind of failed us and the prospects seem pretty bleak there. And at the same time, the publishing world is also bleak in the sense that a publisher like venture capitalists will play the numbers game. They'll bring 100 books out, one works, makes up for all the others. That's what they want. They're not going to nurture a person through 5 drafts of a biography of Verrier Elvin.
Correct.
No one's going to do that today. And I'm like, then where does that come from? Because you need that also. Part of the answer, of course, is the New India Foundation, which you've...
But that's one. But there must be several. Like, I mean, the New India Foundation on
that's
its
a drop in
own
the
country.
ocean.
It's a drop in the ocean. You need like 8 or 10 like this. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So
what we do, for example, I mean, what the New India Foundation does is we now have one of the finest OUP editors who worked with Rukun and who has a cameo appearance in this book, Rivka Israel. He's now on a full-time retainer with the New India Foundation. So before the book by a New India Foundation fellow gets to Penguin or HarperCollins, it's already had top-class editing, which you can take it from me. Given the kind of books they're doing, Harper and Penguin cannot provide, or LF cannot provide it. So Rivka has done that. She's reshaped the arguments, improved the prose, plugged the... and we are lucky, but that's just one organization. I mean, the New India Foundation has just published 33 books, which is not bad, but OEP would have done 300 in the same, because it's a major organization with a large staff and, to sustain it. Yeah.
And I have a feeling that there is actually a hunger for knowledge of this sort, in the sense that, it's pretty frequent. Yesterday you and I happened to bump on a flight. Just before that, someone on the same flight said, "Are you Amit Verma? Thank you for what you do. Great conversations." Later at the baggage belt, I saw another gentleman talking to you, and I presume he would have said something similar to you.
Yeah.
There is a hunger out there for people who want this kind of deep knowledge. And I actually wonder, and I'm thinking aloud here for the benefit of perhaps future publishers or problem solvers who are listening to this, that I think the conventional thinking is that we have short attention spans, everything must be shallow, everything is a race to the lowest common denominator. I think that isn't true, and I think there's an opportunity for someone who figures it out.
Absolutely, without question. I mean, and whether it's cross subsidy, where shall we say Penguin or Harper does a scholarly list, which is for prestige, which is maybe just breaking even, not losing money, but just breaking even, where other books are, but does it for prestige, upmarket. Something like that could be done. Yeah.
So I was sort of struck by another beautiful quote about Rukun, where at one point you quote him in a letter saying, "We badly need fewer human beings in this world. The world needs to become more like Ranikhet in winter, when you see more foxes around our house than people," stop quote. And Ranikhet in winter seemed like a perfect metaphor of the Rukun Advani kind of world. So I want to turn that question on you and ask you, what is your Ranikhet in winter?
My Ranikhet in winter is in the mornings. Currently, I have a aging back problem, so walking is difficult. Kaban Park in the mornings. And in the dark in my room with listening to music in the evening. So that is my Ranikhet in winter.
So how have you changed in terms of how you look at life ahead? Like when we are young, I don't know what kind of daydreamer you were. I would imagine all your early daydreams would be just about cricket and, scoring centuries in test matches or taking 5 wickets or whatever. But how much was your time horizon? What were the kind of things that you would dream of? Were you always a kind of person who would just be one project at a time? Like in your book, you describe at various points how Rukun almost gets exasperated because you keep throwing ideas at him. That let's do this series and I'll edit it for you. Let's do that series, I'll edit it for you. And at one point he tells you that, shut up and write, you don't get into all of this. So tell me a little bit about how your ambitions, not in a crude sense of achieving some worldly goal or the other, but how your ambitions for yourself, how they've changed over the years. Do you look at time differently, and so on and so forth?
So I've always had, from very early on, two or three irons in the fire. So there are always two or three book projects at various stages of completion, conceptualization. So it's not really one at a time. I now recognize that I'm towards the end of my life and my end of my writing career, and the Gandhi biographies are the last really major books I'll do. I mean, I'll write a series of books which will be of varying length and varying importance, but I would like to carry on contributing in other ways. I am no longer associated with the New India Foundation formally. I'm an emeritus trustee, but sort of as a substitute, I've started a series called Indian Lives, which is books published by Harper here and here in America, written by first-stage scholars, biographies written by first-stage scholars. And two have appeared. Patrick Olivell's book on Ashoka and Chitralekha Jutshi's book on Sheikh Abdullah, both first state, and a third book on Kamala Devi by Nico State is coming soon. And I've commissioned about 20 scholars to write on 20 different characters of Indian history whose lives illuminate wider social, political, cultural, intellectual trends and currents. And the idea of this series is as follows. The general reader, the kind of educated reader, finds it easiest to approach history through biographies. So I mentioned E.M.S. Namboodiripad. So the story of modern Kerala through E.M.S. Namboodiripad. The book on Sheikh Abdullah is the story of modern Kashmir through Sheikh Abdullah. That's something that people want to know about lives, and significant, interesting lives. However, on the other hand, scholars have traditionally scorned the writing of biography because they think that they should not be wasting their time writing about a single individual when they could be writing about larger processes. So a typical scholar would want to write a book called Politics and Society in Modern Kashmir rather than Sheikh Abdullah in Modern Kashmir. Right. Now, and to bridge this gap, what's happened is recognizing that there's a gap in the market. People want lives, biographies. Young entrepreneurs without the scholarly training and sometimes even without the scholarly scruple have rushed to fill the gap. So, the market is awash with really bad books on particularly people like Subhash Bose and others of that kind, right, who deserve much better than they've got. So this series tries to fill that. And each book, I'm kind of become like a venture capitalist. So I did, like Patrick Olivell, who wrote this book on Ashoka. He's one of the world's greatest scholars of ancient India. And he and I were in correspondence about something totally different. And I asked him, Patrick, have you ever considered writing a biography? He said, no. I said, will you write on Ashoka? Because that brings, 50 years of your scholarship to bear on, you've always written around Ashoka. And he's produced this absolutely magnificent book. So I'm very excited about this series because I think this is something I can do in a way. I'm not really capable of writing 1,000-page books anymore. I mean, I can't. I mean, the Gandhi biography or India After Gandhi took a decade each. It meant visiting archives all over the world, and I don't have that energy or that, maybe even my intellectual powers are declining. So I recognize when you ask me about time and how I recognize that I may have a few small books to write, which I will continue writing. But perhaps whatever I've learnt can be more fruitfully used by promoting and nurturing and shaping and curating a series like this, Indian Lives.
So one of my friends, Ajay Shah, in fact, two of my friends do this, Roshan Abbas does this as well. They keep talking about how we're going to live till 120. And their whole point is that, no, you must not think you have 20 years left. We have many decades of work ahead of us.
I don't want to live till 120. I'd be happy to go even today. I have no desire to live a long life.
So I would say the same thing.
Particularly long life.
I would say the same thing, but my reason for that would be that I don't want to spend 50 years in dementia. Yeah. But what I have been convinced is that along with the concept of lifespan, there is a concept of health span, which is how long you're healthy for. And these people are trying to convince me that no, the 100-year-old of 30 years later will be like the 60-year-old today. So, so you could forever be 65 by that reckoning. But, so I would encourage you to at least keep writing these small books. Here's my next sort of question sparked by something that you said, that one, that there is a flurry of books out there which are of dubious quality and all that. Now, my belief always is that everything eventually finds its own level. And it strikes me that, just the fact that you are doing a series with a particular branding, Indian Lives, just means that after 2 or 3 books of that series, people will just take it more seriously. If there's something in that series, it is automatically more
Right.
credible. And that brings me to the role in this modern world of, I mean, I don't know what is the appropriate term for it. I use sense makers, some use curators, in the sense that we are awash with knowledge, we are awash with propaganda also, we are awash with news, awash with information from all sides. And increasingly what happens is that we look to individuals as sense makers or curators who make sense of it. For example, during COVID, when there was such a fog of war, eventually I narrowed down on 3 or 4 people who I can trust, and I will follow them on Twitter, and I'm getting my dupe from there. And similarly, in matters of history, there will be names that, people will trust, and so on and so forth. And do you, and I'll ask that question in 2 ways. One, do you feel that in your own consumption of everything that is happening in the world, is that sort of a factor that, are there people who play that kind of role for you who you come to trust more than others?
Obviously, there are some writers I respect and admire more, including columnists, and which is maybe why I tweet their columns more often than I would others. But not really. I mean, for music, maybe more. There are one or two people whose judgment on music I trust a great deal. And yeah.
Yeah, remember the last time we recorded 2 years ago in February, you said you really must do an episode with Keshav Desiraju, and I dawdled as always, and alas, that opportunity is gone. So, coming back to this book, you said that it went through 13 drafts and all of that. What did Rukun think about the shaping of the book? Because here there is obviously the editorial instinct would be alive in him because he's been your editor all your life, even when you haven't directly been working with him. But at the same time, he can't go too far because he's a subject.
So he let it be. He barely intervened, except in the preface. So the preface talks about the changes in the world of publishing. And there he helped me expand it because it was very brief and personal, and he wanted the book to reflect the changing character of Indian publishing. But in the text itself, he virtually did not interfere, partly because it was about him, partly it was because of my book. The odd name he wanted redacted, which I obliged. The odd name I wanted I redacted, which he obliged. But otherwise, he let it be. I mean, it was really his letters that sparkle, and that's the contribution to his book is what I've quoted from him in that, which is quite a lot and very revelatory, and I hope will grab the attention of readers.
Yeah, I was curious about some of the redacted names. One particular redacted name, I tried to figure out who it is by Googling furiously, but I'm an expert searcher, but 20 minutes of search could get me nowhere. As soon as this recording is over, I'll ask you for that name.
I might not tell you, so I'm not revealing anything. The 2 names not redacted are of Shashi Tharoor, because he's a public figure, and Ivan Asquith, who headed the OUP editorial department in Oxford, and who was partly responsible for the destruction of OUP India. But other names are redacted, and you can make your guesses, but I'm not revealing anything.
We shall make our guesses. So my penultimate question, in a sense, refers to something that you pointed out is sort of a difference between you and Rukun. And in a sense, the whole book is this lovely, charming story of a relationship of opposites almost, where you
Absolutely.
are outgoing and gregarious and etc., etc. And he is just the opposite, and it's just such a beautiful relationship. And one of those contrasts is optimism and pessimism, where you're always out there doing stuff because you're optimistic that change can be possible.
Yeah.
And he's sitting in Ranikhet and he's like, just chill, man. People are shit. I know them. So not my words, not his, but so tell me a little bit about that, because, I think every time we record, we speak a little bit about current affairs, which we haven't this time, and we won't after this question. But I'm just wondering about, how does one stay optimistic? What are the things that actually make you optimistic and give you hope and keep you going?
Because it's not just Ajay Shah and his friends, but the people who rule us will not live till 120.
So that alone, just
that's one thing.
Actuarial odds.
That's one thing that keeps me optimistic. Also, large parts of India are, including where we are living in, there's a different kind of. I mean, the change in Karnataka. As you know, I'm not a great fan of the Congress Party, but after the Congress Party came to power in May, the issues of hijab, halal, love jihad, and Tipu Sultan have disappeared from the newspapers. Right? Occasionally, the Congress Party, because it plays soft Hindutva, wants to police and wants to ban alcohol and so on. But I think it's the politics of this country does not make me that pessimistic because it will change. What makes me pessimistic is the global situation. The superpower rivalries, which are just terrible. I mean, what the America and China, the wars, the environmental crisis, those are much more challenging, and we don't really have a understanding of where that will lead us.
And there's something that I absolutely do not have a handle on, which is that when I think of the political marketplace, I think of supply and demand, and I think that always supply will respond to what they feel the demand is. And that is also from where the soft Hindutva of Congress and AAP comes from, because, and I believe it is a misreading. I believe that there is more to India than that, and it is
Absolutely.
not just Hindutva, and there's an absence of imagination there. But equally, I can't get a handle on what future demand will be, because on the one hand, I can fall prey to the selection bias and look at the young people I see around me and say that, hey, it's fine, we'll turn out fine. But on the other hand, that is the selection bias. It's a small sliver
Absolutely.
of people like myself in my echo chamber.
Absolutely.
So what is sort of your sense of how we are shaping up as a society?
It's very hard to, I resist broad generalizations. So all I can say is that as far as I'm concerned, I'll continue to do what I have to do, whether it's the books I have to write or the columns I have to write or the friendships I have to sustain. And not till 120, but maybe till 75 or 80.
I hope it's still 120, but nevertheless. So, final question for the day, because I know you have to go. Recommend to me, since we last met in the last couple of years, therefore, books, music, films that you've really loved and loved so much that you just want everyone to go out there.
So, maybe music, because it's personal. I've been listening a lot to, partly serendipitous, to some great Agra Gharana singers. So Sharafat Hussain Khan, Latafat Hussain Khan, Lalit Rao, and they've just been quite wonderful. And I just keep on listening to them again and again and again. And so that's my great. I vaguely knew about them, but the Agra Gharana vocalists, I've been returning to them a lot. And the second is instrumentalists who are from Calcutta. And I think the Gharana is technically called Senia, Shahjahanpur Gharana. But two great artists, both sarod players, Radhika Mohan Moitro and his disciple Buddhadev Dasgupta, who have a magnificent repertoire and a particular tone and timbre to their playing, which is different and distinctive from Ali Akbar or Amjad, who are much, maybe for good reasons, more celebrated. And it's just been absolutely joyous to discover them afresh. I vaguely knew about them when I was a student in Calcutta. I heard Buddhadev Dasgupta play once or twice. Lalit Rao lives in Bangalore, so I know a little bit about the Agra Gharana, but I've been discovering them a lot. And I think compared to more celebrated vocalists, they're equally good and incredibly enriching. So that's I'd say Sharafat, Latafat, Lalit Rao and her disciples, the one side of the Agra Gharana, and Radhika Mohan Moitro and Buddhadev Dasgupta on the sarod. It's just been, it keeps me optimistic in a sense. It keeps me sane, whole. More than books and films, it's really the music.
You're going to decline my request because you will feel that it would be, you don't want to be self-indulgent. But if you ever wrote a memoir about your journey through music, what you discovered and what it did to you, I would love that so much. But
so I cannot, because I don't know enough about it. So cricket I did.
But it can be impressionistic. You don't need to be an expert.
No, I've been encouraging our mutual friend Saman Subramanian to write a memoir of that kind, because he knows much more, I mean, the odd column I've written about 4 or 5 columns about music, which I'm not ashamed about. One on Bhimsen, one on Ulas Kashalkar, one on a particular Bade Gulam composition of Hamsas Bani. But that's the length at which my knowledge, my limited rudimentary knowledge, can sustain expression. 1,200 words, not a whole book. I would write other memoirs. I mean, I would like to write a memoir one day of my life with Gandhi. So my journey with Gandhi as a scholar, as meeting Gandhians, the changing landscape of how people are thinking about Gandhi, why the world has turned against Gandhi. So I will write a memoir of that. I may one day write a full-fledged political memoir of all that I've seen in my 65 years in India, from the time of Nehru to the night time of Modi. But music, I just don't. I know कि मेरे बस की नहीं है. I mean, that's just I know I can't write a novel. I can't write a book on music. I mean, what it gives me is incalculable. But the other people will have to write. As a Samant is one, maybe there's I won't put Nazar on her, but there's a young scholar, not younger than me, scholar and writer of music in Bangalore, and she's writing something, a kind of memoir of her guru, and I very much look forward to that. But I just don't have the competence.
You don't want to jinx her like you jinx Shekhar Pathak, where, at the end of that.
But 30 years later, it came out.
30 years later, it came out. You use the phrase, we've used the phrase literature from above and history from below. There is also a memoir from within. So one day I hope you do write about music. You don't have to be an expert. I would certainly jump out and buy it. Ram, thank you so much. It's been such an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Amit. Always so nice to talk to you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, share it with whoever you feel may like it. Head on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and pick up The Cooking of Books by Ramachandra Guha. In fact, pick up every one of Ram's books. They're all awesome. You can follow Ram on Twitter at Ram_Guha. You can follow me at Amit Verma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.